Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. We're happy to welcome you to today's presentation of results from the final performance evaluation of the Nuyok Resilience Food Security Activity, or RIFSA, implemented by Catholic Relief Services in 4 Western districts of Karamoja, Uganda. My name is Tom Spangler, and I work with Save the Children as Activity Director for the Impel Associate Award. I'll ask Terry to paste a link in the chat box to a 2-page brief that provides a bit more detailed information on Impel's activities. Some of you will know that the overall purpose of Impel is to conduct both performance and impact evaluations and facilitate knowledge sharing to improve the design and implementation of BHA-funded RIFSAs. Today's presentation will be led by Tango International. Tango is among the first of Impel's 5 research partners and has extensive experience in designing and conducting rigorous research on food and livelihood security programming throughout sub-Saharan Africa, including previous research for BHA. I'll pass it first to Monica Mueller, Senior Technical Specialist, who will then introduce her colleagues on the Tango research team. They'll be giving an overview of the Nuyok program and evaluation design and methods used, as well as results from the inline evaluation. Tango will also be responding to any questions you might have about the findings, but we ask that they be given time to do that after they've completed their presentation. So for anyone who has questions during the presentation, we ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enter your questions so that we can efficiently answer as many as possible during the Q&A session. Finally, today's presentation will be recorded, but only for Impel and BHA reference, and the recording will not be shared publicly. So again, we thank you for joining us today, and I'll pass it off to Monica to get us started. Monica.
Great, thanks, Tom, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone from wherever you're calling in from. As Tom said, I'm Monica Mueller. On the Tango side, I am not alone today, even though I'll be the main presenter for the slide presentation. Waiting in the wings backstage, we have a lot of the Tango team who worked on this project. So Gita Temsa, who has been the activity director from our side, and the quantitative team, Stephanie Martin and Tom Bauer. We have the qualitative lead, Jean Downen, as well as the project director and Tango principal, Mark Langworthy. So they will be monitoring the chat and Q&A and be able to respond to your questions as we go, as Tom said, but also joining in the discussion likely when we get to the Q&A. So thanks to all of that, my own team for that support. Feels good going in. All right, so just in terms of the sequence of the presentation, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, not to the Karamoja region. I think the audience here is fairly familiar with that, but rather to the evaluation itself. We'll be talking about context actually quite a bit in the course of presenting the findings. Then a very quick activity overview, description of the evaluation methodology, the findings themselves, and I should note that the report itself is divided into chapters with separate discussions for the different evaluation questions. So separate chapters for achievement and targeting, for effectiveness, and for sustainability. We're smooshing those all together in the interest of time. So we will just discuss all of those 3 themes by thematic area. Then we'll move on to the unintended consequences, both positive and negative, and have a section on lessons learned and good practices before moving on to the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Oh, do you see background?
No.
I do, Terry. We
do. Now I do. Sorry, it's on a different screen. All right. So I think as a lot of the folks participating today are aware, this was a mixed methods performance evaluation. And as Tom said in his introduction, it was funded by Impel, conducted by our team here at Tango International. Huge partnership with our local partner, IRC, the International Research Consortium of Uganda. They were the ones who did led the household survey and the qualitative data collection in the field. And we provided the training and tools development and monitoring and QA of their work in a real-time fashion. This follows a baseline conducted in 2018, about 5 years ago, but the data collection for this evaluation we're discussing today happened last summer, July and August of 2023. Should recognize also that this project closed out at the end of September of last year. Next slide. Nuyok was implemented by CRS and its partners. It was originally a 5-year RIFSA and received a 1-year extension, so it ended up being a 6-year RIFSA, spanning from 2017 to 2023. Works in 4 western districts of Karamoja, Abim, Nakapiripirit, Naknepak, and Nabilatuk. My apologies for any mispronunciations that I've just made. And the activity has 4 purposes with the following focuses. So the first purpose is on governance and gender, the second on resilience to shocks and stresses, the third is on livelihoods, whether those be on-farm, off-farm, non-farm, with the idea to improve production. The fourth purpose is on health and nutrition of both women and women, girls, and children under 5. And throughout all of these purposes are interwoven cross-cutting themes of gender, environmental protection, and youth interventions. Next slide, please. So there are 4 explicit evaluation objectives, and this is kind of the sequence that the report follows in terms of structuring the discussion. The first 2 are regarding performance of the RIFSA. The third is about the effectiveness of the technical approaches in achieving the outcomes of the project. And then lastly, there are objectives about identifying those positive and negative unintended consequences and lessons learned. Next slide, please. So the methodology. This was a pre-post performance evaluation. It's important to note this was not and never intended as an impact evaluation. There is no counterfactual. So one of the characteristics is that we're actually not able to make attributions or causation of results to project interventions. It was a population-based survey. Although the household survey did have questions to identify participants and be able to do a count of, who was participating in which kinds of interventions. It bears noting that the baseline data were collected in primarily in June of 2018, and now 5 years later, a very close by time frame with data collection in July and August of 2023. Starting with the household survey and then moving at the very end of that to the qualitative data collection. And as I said earlier, IRC was our firm on the ground doing that data collection. Quantitative analysis has a number of different comparisons, and the report and especially the annexes are very rich in presenting those comparisons. So we have baseline versus end line for the sample as a whole. We have comparisons at end line between direct and non-direct participants, meaning RIFSA and then non-RIFSA participants. There are descriptive analyses and a few results coming from multivariate equations. The qualitative analysis I see is cut off the screen, but I can tell you that the qualitative purpose is really to provide context and try to explain some of the results that were found. And triangulate those results. Next slide, please. And next slide. So first, let's talk a little bit about who participated in or what the participation levels were in the different interventions. So there's 3 categories of interventions. We have the community groups, trainings, and services. And there are actually 48 different kinds of interventions. So obviously I'm not going to list all of those here for space and efficiency, but just to give a sense of what we're talking about, When we say community groups, we're talking about the savings and internal lending committees, which are SILCs, producer marketing groups, home improvement campaigns, et cetera. Training, there's a long list of possible trainings people could have participated in, such as WASH, kitchen gardens, which would include perma gardens, backyard gardens, et cetera, crop production. And then services is a mixed bag of things that don't fall into those other categories, such as cashier work and nutrition vouchers. So about half of the respondents to the household survey received at least one intervention, one or more interventions. On average, a household participated in 3.5, rounding up to 4 interventions. And then if we break that down a bit, we can see that each household participated in, on average, 2 groups and on average 2 trainings or services. Next slide, please. So here you get a sense of what the participation levels were in the different categories. So the chart on the left is showing you group participation. And remember again that households on average participated in 1.7 or 2 different groups. The topmost was mother care groups, followed closely by home improvement campaigns, and then by the savings groups. The next 3 are a little lower percentages, but they're still important to mention here. Water user committees, and then the different kinds of lead farmers, whether as couples or individuals. Moving to the graph on the right, we've combined the trainings and services categories. If we look at those categories, the most commonly participated in category was WASH, followed by kitchen gardens and crop production and silks. ENHA refers to essential nutrition hygiene actions, I believe. So basically nutrition and health trainings. And another abbreviation to know is the PHHS, which stands for post-harvest handling and storage. Next slide, please. Just a couple slides on targeting. Overall, the project was designed to target women, men, and youth. There are specific interventions that are focused on pregnant and lactating women, adolescent girls, and children under 5. And an explicit intention to include high vulnerability groups, such as the poorest of the poor, which would include the landless, elderly, community members, and persons with disabilities. When our discussion of targeting is in the report is about both the decision on on who to target, as well as the approaches to targeting. And overall, the decision on who to target was viewed very favorably by both the key informants that we spoke with, as well as focus groups. And there was a widespread sentiment that people who with the greatest need were indeed targeted and reached. And there was a special shout out to the focus on male youth because of the historical association of male youth with conflict. Idleness, lack of education, those kinds of things can be mitigated a bit with when there are activities, especially income generating opportunities, that can keep those male youth engaged in more positive behaviors and activities. When we look at some of the results for indicators, and we just disaggregate those by poor, the poor and non-poor, we can also kind of retroactively see that there were good results for the poorer categories, which also suggests that the targeting was well done. Next slide, please. In terms of the targeting approach, this was also widely complemented. Key informants and community members said that there were ample, adequate staff on the ground throughout the project, including at the very beginning, and that those staff were of different technical specialties. This helped with, marketing the program, getting the word out, engaging people at the beginning and keeping them engaged. The staff were able to make meaningful connections with community members and really get them involved in the program. So that staff presence in the field was a real plus. Similarly, a real plus was having the engagement and monitoring activities of the CBMs, which stands for community-based monitors, also involvement of health center staff and school staff. They were all involved in some way in monitoring the BRIFSA intervention and its activities. And this was another, good piece of community engagement. There was, again, a special highlighting of the effectiveness of registering pregnant and lactating women separately, because it allowed the program to tailor to their particular nutritional needs. And there was also praise for the approach to WASH. So households that built latrines were, became participants in trainings. So other households were able to observe this and, be encouraged to build their own latrines so they would have access to those trainings. Next slide, please. So we're moving on to the purposes now. So starting with the foundational purpose, which is food and nutrition security. Next slide. Just a note, both in the presentation and in the report, we're going to give precise estimates when the figures and the comparisons are statistically significant. It's also important to mention somehow when results are not statistically significant. So in those cases, for example, when there is no baseline end line change, we're just going to give you an approximate number. So there's a good example of this in this first bullet. The indicator of moderate to severe insecurity did not change, but from baseline to end line in the overall sample. But just so you have as a point of reference, that figure was around 90%. So about 90% of the overall sample at both baseline and end line measurement points were moderately to severely food insecure. One of the indicators for food insecurity is the HDDS, which stands for Household Dietary Diversity Score. And this indicator is a measure of the number of food groups that the household consumed in the last 24 hours. And there's a possible category, a maximum number of 12 food groups. So this did improve slightly. Again, here we're giving you precise numbers. And so this is, we understand to be statistically significant. So households at baseline consumed 3.1 different food categories at baseline and 3.5 at end line. And important to note here that the numbers were slightly higher for the RIFSA households. The multivariate analysis, and Stephanie and Tom and Gita can dig into that if we need to, if there are questions about it. But basically, the multivariate analysis showed an association between participation in training and higher household dietary diversity. So that's a promising finding, indicating that the approach to training was actually effective. We also have breakdown of where which food categories did see improved consumption or increased consumption. And those increases were found in the categories of eggs, seeds, and legumes, again, attributed to the nutritional trainings. You'll see here and in future slides that sometimes the needle was not moved, as they say, and on some important indicators we would have wished to see more improvement. The context here was pretty rough, so the challenges that lead farmers called out over and over again were the drought and insecurity referring to conflict, raids, theft, etc. So these were pretty big challenges throughout the 6-year program. On the other hand, there was a lot of praise for the training and a lot of praise for the approach. So the mother care groups, the home improvement campaigns were felt by both focus groups and the key informants to be very effective ways of reaching people, and also that there really was a lot of knowledge uptake. Even though the numbers are not showing big changes here, there was still a lot of information learned. That includes also nutrition training for the specific needs of nutrition needs of pregnant women. Next, please. Sustainability. So when we look at this first purpose, what can we say about sustainability? And as with the other findings on sustainability, I should note that these are all perception based. So this is all, taken from what we heard from key informants and qualitative respondents in the field. Again, the knowledge, information, capacity that the project conveyed doesn't go away. So that is a really positive thing, and people will be able to apply those things when circumstances are right. There was also a lot of optimism about the changes in gender roles, and we'll talk a little bit more later about shifts. A lot of this brought about by male change agents. So we're starting to see shifts, like with men being more supportive of women on domestic tasks, on caring for children, on making sure they go to their antenatal care visits, a lot more cooperation and joint decision making. So there was a lot of optimism that these kinds of shifts were moving and going to continue to move in a positive direction. Still have to note that the gender dynamics in this region have been in place for a very long time. So we are still up against, I don't like to say up against, there are still cultural considerations and social factors to consider when you think about sustained long-term change in the gender dynamics in society. And another question was raised about the continuity of the monitoring activities. I think this had a lot to do with the community-based monitors. So there was some question over, where is the mandate coming from? Will they have continued? Where does future training come from? How are we going to, keep doing these things, and under whose leadership? Next slide, please. Moving on to purpose 1, which is about resilience and shocks. Next slide, please. Okay, so the shock count is high. The shock count was high at baseline and high at end line. So we're at both measurement points, households are experiencing 5 to 6 shocks within the previous year. The second bullet talks about an indicator called the shock exposure index. And you will see that this went down a tiny bit. This is on a scale of 0 to 100. So the shock exposure index went down from 31.9 to 28.7. The reason that doesn't precisely mirror the non-change in the shock count is because this index takes into consideration some additional components, namely perceptions of how shocks affected the household's ability to, have food and income. So again, these are both perception-based measures, and the second one is a little more complicated than the first. So that's why you see a little bit of variation. The graph at the right shows the top shocks. The blue lines are baseline, the green lines are end line. Stat sig changes in most of these, and I would highlight that drought and increasing food prices remain the top 2 shocks that households had experienced in the past year. Also, there were pretty marked differences if we looked lower down in the graph. Theft of livestock went from 5% at baseline to 39% at endline. Also, theft and destruction of assets went from 8 to 27%. And this is an indicator that is exclusive of livestock. So it's different kinds of theft and asset theft. So those are both conflict-related variables, conflict-related shocks, where we saw some significant and substantial worsening, really. Let's move to the next. Oh, and I guess one more point to make is that these shocks were, we call them covariate shocks. They're experienced not just by a single household, but they affect the entire community. They're systemic shocks. So, whether you're a New York household or a non-New York household, these are likely to have some impact on you. Next slide. So how did households cope with these shocks? So here's where we looked at both the quantitative survey data as well as the qualitative data. When you look at the survey indicators, there are some that on their surface look like the results might be contradictory. So for example, 91% of households report going a whole day without eating. However, only 23% report reducing their food consumption in the last year. So we would actually argue that where this could be showing underreporting, it could also be showing overreporting. We would argue that a lot of these discrepancies have to do with normalization of coping strategies. So whereas 1 year ago, you may have had to go a day without eating and it was a big deal. Whereas maybe last month you did the same thing, but now you've gotten used to it. So it's just become the new normal to have these be using these more extreme or harmful coping strategies. So those are some of the reasons that we're guessing that there's an underreporting here rather than overreporting. The most common coping strategies at the end line measurement point were reducing food consumption, taking up new work. The only one of all the different strategies that we measured that showed a stat sig change was emergency food aid. So this went from 0 at baseline to about 11% using some kind of emergency food aid by the time the end line had come around. Next slide. Resilience capacities. Folks are probably familiar that we measure the free capacities using different indices. So we have absorptive capacity, adaptive, and transformative capacity. Each of these is comprised of a whole number of components. The thing to notice here, each index goes from 0 to 100, and what we're looking for is higher index scores. So the closer you are to 100, the higher your resilience is in that particular category. So the thing to notice here is really that there were improvements in both absorptive and adaptive capacities. So absorptive going up from 20 to 26, adaptive going up from 39 to 45. So this is positive movement. It's a desired movement. Another thing to notice is that if we break this down into RIFSA versus non-RIFSA households, the RIFSA households are doing better on all 3 capacities, in fact. So absorptive, you've got the RIFSA households having a score of 30 versus a lower score for non-RIFSA of 22.3. The only index where we did not see a significant change from baseline to end line was transformative, and that's probably not that surprising, the finding, just because transformative resilience is something a little longer term. If you look at the drivers of transformative capacity in this study, we're looking at access to infrastructure, livestock services, basic services, markets. These are slow to change, so it's not something you're necessarily going to see a difference in within the course of a few months or a single project or a few years even. So we did not see significant change in that index. But again, we did see positive change for the RIFSA households. So this suggests that there is something that the RIFSA households have that the non-RIFSA don't. And you know, the idea would be that hopefully it's project activities. Next slide, please. So what about the sustainability for these shock findings? There were lots of comments made about the importance of disaster management committees and disaster management plans, and specifically about the existence and linkages between village committees and district committees. Something this has got going for it as well is that the government is allocating budgets for these committees. The government is mandating that committees and disaster management plans exist. So these are structural systemic changes, again, in that transformative capacity bucket that are very promising for future sustainability. FMNR interventions, also very well received. FMNR stands for Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration. This refers to land restoration, conservation efforts, and trying to have healthy land and put that land to productive uses. So farmers recognized the connection between the practices that they were being taught and how that linked to their own abilities to graze, to divert and collect and store water, and then even to sell fruit trees they had planted and get income from those sales. So again, a really positive receipt of those trainings and initiatives by the communities. One of the threats to sustaining those is deforestation. When times are hard, people still may be deforesting to generate and harvest charcoal. So, that can be a backward slide, and also the cost and the affordability of fruit tree seedlings going forward. Next slide. Moving on to livelihoods. Next slide.
Monica?
Yes.
Monica, this is Mara. I just want to let you know that we were hoping to have Q&A in about 10 to 15 minutes.
Got it. Okay. I'll speed through. Thanks, Mara. Okay, so poverty indicators, we're looking at the economic side of things here. Contextually, poverty is just high in the entire area. This is one of the ones where we look at the sample overall, we don't see significant changes in the main three indicators. So we do want to break it down to see how do RIFSA and non-RIFSA households compare. On all three indicators, the RIFSA households are doing better. So, and in reviewing this slide last night with Stephanie, our quant lead, she said, this is big. This is a big finding. So not only is it stat sig, but we have our quant team saying this is substantial and worth noting. So we have a lower depth of poverty for the RIFSA households, lower prevalence of poverty for RIFSA households, and higher expenditures for RIFSA households. So these are all good outcomes for project households. Next slide. On average, households have about 3 livelihoods. This has not changed from baseline to end line. Again, we do see a pretty big difference between RIFSA and non-RIFSA households. 4 livelihoods for RIFSA households versus almost 3 for non-RIFSA. So again, something different is happening in those different households. The main livelihoods remain the same: crop production, agricultural labor. As we noted earlier, well, this is interesting. I guess this is up for discussion, but there was a significant increase in sales of wild bush products. 39% to 53%. I guess we can talk about if that's a good or a bad thing. Of course, if it's harvesting charcoal, that may not be a positive outcome. It's more of a harder coping strategy or a more harmful coping strategy. But that is to note that there was a significant change here. Next slide. Another significant change was the use of cash assistance, more so by RIFSA households than by non-RIFSA. I'm going to try and breeze through some of these findings because you'll have them in the report. This was a big one as well: an increased engagement in cash earning opportunities across the sample, but especially notable that there were higher rates for RIFSA households. And when you look at the qualitative explanation for this, people attributed that increase to diversifying the crops they were planting and engaging in different livelihoods. Next slide. Another biggie was an increased use of financial services, primarily agricultural savings mechanisms. So here's where the SILCs came in. Again, the RIFSA households did better here, and that is likely attributable to their participation and capacities built through SILCs, as well as through the training that gave the financial literacy as well as to safety nets. All of those things gave people the confidence and knowledge and capacity to actually have some savings that they could then invest in their agricultural work and their livestock work. Next slide. Value chain activity participation remained about the same between baseline and end line, with about a third of the households participating in value chain activities. Again, higher for participants. The qualitative data explain a bit that there were some challenges with the cooperative marketing activities, and I was looking last night at how, what the examples were. It was kind of a mixed list of explanations for why this was rough. And I think the general theme was that people had the knowledge and the information on what cooperative marketing is and what bulking is, but they're still kind of early in their development and not yet very strong organizations yet, even though producer marketing groups were facilitated to become cooperatives. They're still building those linkages. They're still learning how to do this. And so we're just not moving the needle there just yet. Moving on, there was, if you look overall at the adoption of the sustainable agricultural practices, there was not a big change, but there were significant changes for specific practices like pest control and agroforestry, the latter of which is an FMNR activity. And again, RIFSA households are doing better here. Another multivariate equation that our quant team can unpack a bit is that there is an association between household dietary diversity and participation in these agricultural groups. So again, there's evidence there that these approaches are having an effect on household health and nutrition. Next. Sustainability. A lot of appreciation for the agricultural extensionists, the community animal health workers. There's a lot of interest in both providing and receiving those services, even with people saying they would pay for them. So there's really a lot of promise here in those kinds of extension activities continuing. SILC is also very likely to continue. Again, structurally, the environment is rich there for those to carry on because of the government's parent development model. So the SILCs are very consistent with that, and that again bodes well for sustainability. The linkages that have been made with input dealers are expected to sustain. And again, one of the key things here is that people they're seeing the results. They're seeing that when they're using approved seeds, when they're using the new practices that they've been taught, they are seeing more productivity and healthier land, et cetera. And so this motivates people to continue, which all bodes well for sustainability. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Just some highlights here. So underweight indicator for women of reproductive age has not seen a stat sig change. It's stayed about the same between baseline and end line. Yeah, I don't think we see any big stat changes on this slide. So let's just move since we have limited time. One thing I did want to point out, because I know some of our reviewers were excited about this finding, was that there was an increase in a specific family planning method. So lactational amenorrhea method, I might be pronouncing that wrong, but that method usage did increase from a little under 1% to over 5%. So this is a positive finding. Overall, though, family planning or contraceptive prevalence is still on the low side. Antenatal care visits also went up. Again, I mentioned earlier that men are getting more involved in understanding the importance of antenatal care, and so that is also helping women go for those visits. And again, as I mentioned, there is more joint cooperation on decision making around both women's health and child health and nutrition. Next slide. child anthropometric indicators. So none of these, the three big ones, stunting, underweight, and wasting, none of those saw a stat sig change. However, let us not despair because, again, we've emphasized what a difficult context that people are facing in the Karamoja region. This actually we can look at as a very positive finding when we take it in context, because really the context is really rough with climate change, with drought, with conflict. So there's a very good chance that the program has actually helped these and these indicators not worsen. So stability sometimes in itself it can be a very positive outcome. Next slide. This is a very specific one. Let's just skip this so we can get to Q&A a little faster. Yeah, diarrhea and wash. Yeah, we did not see, we saw some worsening here, which we really need to note. So there was an increase in diarrhea from baseline to end line overall, especially in poor households where diarrhea in children under 5 went from 30% to 40%. There was some improvement in the non-poor households. There was a decrease in kids who were treated with ORT, especially for poor households. We did try to look into this with the qualitative data that we gathered, and we don't have further insight on that, but there's just a survey finding to contemplate. Even though we have these difficult numbers for the wash, for the diarrhea rates, it is important to notice that the qualitative data were actually very, very positive. So there was a perception that diarrhea and wash-related illnesses or waterborne illnesses had improved. And there was really an appreciation for the knowledge and training that they received regarding the connection between healthy households, healthy water, safe water, and health. So I think there actually were more gains here than are apparent in the numbers. Borehole rehabilitation was really appreciated. And again, there's a lot of motivation to continue with the borehole work. Next slide. Similarly, drinking water, there were really good improvements here. A lot of this had to do with the borehole work. At this point, 90% are accessing tube wells or boreholes. The time to collect water is going down, which is the direction that we want to see. Nevertheless, access to sanitation facilities is still on the low side. Higher for Nuyok households than for others, but still we're looking at some difficult environmental and cultural practices here, such as just a long tradition of open defecation, and some contextual challenges like poor soils. So these latrines are collapsing when it comes to the rainy times, and so it's going to take some time to really strengthen the water sanitation infrastructure. Next slide. Yeah, so sustainability of these health and nutrition and wash outcomes. Again, I think the big gains here are in knowledge and information and understanding the connection between using these practices and the improvements in health and nutrition. So participants in the qualitative really called out changes in dietary diversity, changes in health, changes in knowledge, and some of the things they attributed that to were the kitchen gardens and the home improvement campaigns. So people are now motivated to pay the water user committee fees so they can maintain and repair boreholes. The government is also motivated, but again, there's resource issues there. The mail change agents, a lot of positive feedback on those, and they seem to enjoy the volunteering. They were very effective as models and as trainers of whether it's gender roles or health practices or conflict issues. Mail change agents were very positively reviewed, I should say.
Monica, apologies for interrupting. This is Tom.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask if we can wrap up in the next couple minutes to save as much time as possible for questions that are coming.
Will do.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on. Yeah, we've talked about FMNR. group cohesion, social capital, all strengthened by these groups. Let's move on. I think the one I would point out here in negative consequences was that some of the activities actually, because they improved people's means, they attracted raiders. So improved, healthy livestock were actually very appealing to raiders, so that increased people's security risks. In-kind inputs also attracted thieves. Sometimes latrines were also an issue because people wanted to be hiding out in those latrine spaces. So that was an unintended security risk that some of the activities had a part in. Let's move on. Move on. Yeah, I'm going to be super quick here. We've already talked about the effectiveness of these community groups. That approach was just very, very widely praised as being, probably one of the strongest pieces of the conflict. Getting involved with existing groups, strengthening them, working with them throughout the project on the various different purposes. Next. Community-based monitoring was really called out often in terms of a good accountability practice. So let's go move to the next slide. Layering, again, a common theme and theory of change. A theory of change that explains why layering works and why an intersectoral approach is effective. Again, something to make sure that people have a handle on, so they know that how their activities fit with everyone else's activities and why they work together to forward the project goals. Next. Mindset change. I think this is our last slide. Again, this is a region where there's been a lot of aid dependency, and when emphasized that the Nuyok approach of self-reliance was very well received. It abandoned any kind of free handout approach and was really looking to empower communities. So we're saying, let's keep going with that. Next slide. I know this is the last slide. Yeah, because this is the clincher here is, I'll just read the quote. Unless the insecurity situation in the region is resolved, the people of Karamoja are very far from enjoying progress in the developmental projects that are intended to bring positive changes. So this came out again and again that the conflict issue really is a very strong determinant of food security, of health, of the community development, and that really needs to be integrated into any theory of change and into layering going forward. I will stop. So let's go with the Q&A. I hope this was helpful.
It was very helpful. Thank you, Monica. I know that we're pressed for time, both for the presentation and Q&A, so we'll get as far as we can. I'll point people to the Q&A box and the chat where some questions have already been answered. One is that, yes, you will be getting a version of this slide deck. Given that we won't be able to answer all the questions, we have tracked these, and you will also be seeing written responses to the questions that we won't have time to answer today. But let me just start, and this is not in order of importance in the order in which they were received, but Mike Mansky is asking if we could go back to the slide on minimum acceptable diet and exclusive breastfeeding. So he felt there may be some significant findings there. I'll encourage others while Tango is speaking to that, please raise your hand if you'd like to come off mute and pose your question yourself.
I'd like to flag the question on latrines in the chat. During the midterm, it was noted that collapsing latrines was a problem, but it seems like gains were not made over the course of the RIFSA to fix this. Any qualitative data on collapsing latrines and whether there was improvements there, and if they just failed or if there were no efforts put in there. Thanks.
On the MAD question, can I defer to a quantitative person for that? On the latrine issue, having looked at the raw data myself, I just do recall that the latrine collapse remains an issue. In addition, the slabs sometimes were a bit out of reach because they were not affordable. They were heavy and hard to carry out to some of the more rural areas. But I do recall that in comparison to midterm, I don't know, but I do recall that issue coming up numerous times in the qualitative data that the soils and the collapses were a continuing issue. We can look at that in a little bit more after today, but I do recall that as a recurrent issue. Could one of my quant specialist colleagues address the MAD results?
This is Stephanie. I was answering another question, so let me look at this and get back to you. Sorry.
Okay.
And just another one, Stephanie, that may be a little bit related to the results, as has been pointed out, the time lag between dissemination of the nutrition vouchers and the end line. So whether and to what extent that may have affected results as well is an open question. Okay, let me just go ahead and just kind of handpick some others. I think there were a number of questions just around the comparison between participants and non-participants and why at baseline with those different groups, why that may not have constituted treatment and control. Stephanie, maybe if you could explain that a bit better, that would be helpful.
I think
Sorry.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, sorry, I'll jump in on that a bit. I typed in a response to that to I think it was Dustin's comment. So generally the issue is, it's in technical term. Well, there's two things. One is at the baseline. So these are population-based samples. Both the baseline and the end line were population-based samples. And at the baseline, there was no information about a participation of the respondents because there were interventions were not in place at that point. And then when we look at the comparison between participants and non-participants in the end line, we have to be concerned about the technical issue would be selection bias, namely that there may be some targeting issues of why, the characteristics of households that participate in project activities may be different from non-participants. So, for example, to take a hopefully not a correct example, but a possibility that participants are richer than non-participants. And so what we might, if we look at the differences between outcome indicators in terms of poverty rates or food security status, the differences that we see between those two groups may not be related to participation directly, but the underlying differences between the participants, the households that decided to participate and those that did not participate. So that's sort of the fundamental problem of just looking at making a comparison between participants and non-participants at the end line. Now, one of the things that we try to do, and what we have done in the analysis is to try and control for some of those underlying differences between participants and non-participants. And that's the multiple regression analysis that we do. So we look at, in addition to whether households participate or not participate, other factors that may explain differences across the two groups, like income levels and so on. So that's sort of one of the reasons why we've undertaken the regression analysis to try and control for the possibility of this selection bias problem. But it's still not a particularly an exactly clean comparison, because there could very well be underlying differences that are not observable or that we haven't measured in our data, so we can't really control for them. Over.
Thank you, Mark. I know that we're very limited on time left. I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions, and they center around the topic of sustainability. So Michelle Gamber asks, it's noted in the presentation that male change agents were important. It also needed additional support to continue on after the life of the award. She's asking to speak of the feasibility of that. Likewise, Junie Kanawati says for similar projects in other contexts, it's found that often there's much more time is needed to be able to see significant measurable impact. I'm wondering if that might be an observation of Tango here, that while things are on the right track in a very difficult context, maybe just more time would be needed to see that impact. If you could speak to either of those points in the time we have, that would be great. So just about sustainability, again, male change agents, the feasibility of that sustainability and what we might see an impact if given more time.
I was actually going to give just my personal answer to the second question before consulting with my team here, but I would say to Judy, yes, longer term is probably you know, what we're looking at. I mean, when you look at some of these activities are targeting it's societal norms. So whether it's about gender or about use of latrines, I mean, these are practices that have been in use and understanding for, you know, hundreds of years. So you need, you know, constant reinforcement, concert support, concert resources for quite some time to really move the needle on those.
Thank you,
Over.
Monica. I know that is a deep, rich question, especially in the context of Karamoja. So let me say thank you to everyone who's joined today. Apologies that we couldn't take more time for all of your question and answers, but rest assured, you will be getting a copy of the slide deck, and we will be giving written responses to each of these questions, both the ones we've answered here and ones we haven't gotten to. So please stay tuned for that. Please do send additional questions if you have them. And thank you very much for your time today. Thanks especially to Tango for the presentation.
Thanks, Tom.